Thank you so much, Patrizia, for that really kind introduction. And thank you to the Park Center and judges for recognizing my work. It's really an honor to share this award alongside reporters and outlets doing such really important work. And I'm truly humbled to receive an award honoring the legacy of I.F. Stone, fellow Pennsylvania native, actually, who famously said, bureaucracies put out so much that they cannot help letting the truth slip from time to time. And Stone's exhaustive critical reviews of all those materials bureaucracies put out unearthed information hiding in plain sight that undercut official claims. I think many of us rely on that approach, and I certainly did for these stories. When I first heard California regulators assure consumers that it's safe to eat crops grown with oil companies' wastewater, my first reaction was, really? I was really curious to see what evidence they used to decide it was a good idea for farmers who export pistachios and almonds around the world to use this wastewater. As it turned out, there was a massive amount of material to scrutinize, but amazingly little evidence to support regulators' claims. Instead, local water regulators seem to be deferring to the region's multi-billion-dollar industries, big oil and big ag. The heart of California's oil production occurs in Kern County in the Central Valley, about 130 miles north of LA. But all the easy to extract oil is gone, so it takes more and more water to get the really heavy crude out of the region's aging oil fields. And this produces massive volumes of wastewater called produced water. Kern County is also one of the richest agricultural regions in the world. And driving along county roads, you're likely to see pump jacks extracting oil alongside orchards and row crops. And though right now, California is struggling with the aftermath of a series of unprecedented storms and flooding, the state just went through the driest 2 decades in 1,200 years. So when Chevron offered its wastewater as an alternative source of water for farmers, a local irrigation district manager called it a win-win. So this practice has been going on since the mid-90s, but it kind of flew under the radar until about 2015 when rumors started, flowing about that farmers were growing crops with fracking wastewater. And regulators first tried to assure consumers that fracking wastewater can't be used for irrigation. Then they launched a big food safety project and hired what they called a neutral third party to study the safety of growing crops with this wastewater. The project went on for about 5 years, generating a tremendous amount of material, hours and hours of transcripts from public meetings, piles of documents and reports. And I analyzed all these materials along with all the scientific papers I could find on produced water. And the more I scrutinized the way the food safety project was configured and the evidence it produced, the more problems I found. For starters, the project was deeply compromised by conflicts of interest. The food safety panel was not an independent science panel at all, but a stakeholder panel. It included people who represented the powerful almond board and had actually worked for the oil industry. So people with vested interests in the outcome of this project. And regulators' so-called neutral consulting firm, the firm, GSI Environmental, actually had a long history of working as a consultant and expert witness for the oil industry, including Chevron, the largest provider of produced water to farmers. An environmental advocate told the regulator in charge of the project that people with ties to the almond and oil industries could not provide unbiased scientific reviews of the evidence and should be removed immediately. Instead, the regulator said, "We think with diverse perspectives, we will get the best results." And when I asked the same regulator if he knew that this neutral consultant had essentially operated as an in-house product defense firm for the oil industry, he told me that it would have been almost impossible to find a consultant that did no work for oil companies, but had the expertise needed for this type of project. This, of course, was not true. But even worse, it showed that conflicts of interest were so pervasive, no one even gave them a second thought. And given this background, the project's conclusions were unsurprising. As one scientist told me, the way the studies were designed and the evidence they produced or it's sufficient to draw any conclusions about anything, let alone safety. Still, regulators told consumers they found no evidence of elevated health risks. And I discovered it didn't matter that regulators had banned the use of fracking wastewater for irrigation, because many of the same toxic chemicals are used in conventional and fracking operations and pose many of the same risks. Also troubling, regulators never considered the long list of health problems linked to living near oil and gas drilling, including the stress of having an industrial sounding drilling rig going 24/7 in your backyard. They considered that out of scope. It seemed incredible to me that California, a drought-prone state that presents itself as a climate leader, allows oil companies to use fresh water to extract the fossil fuels that exacerbate drought. And analyzing state records, we found that oil companies use hundreds of millions of gallons of high-quality water a year. We also found that this is likely a huge underestimate because the industry's water use records are filled with so many emissions and errors. Regulators basically have no idea how much fresh water the industry uses, even as the state asks people to cut their water use, and people in low-income communities and communities of color are running out of water. Fleshing out the problems in the way regulators decided it was safe to irrigate crops with the oil industry's wastewater, it was painstaking. It required wading through highly technical evidence and piles of documents. I am so grateful to the Park Center and the judges for recognizing this type of work. And I'm truly grateful to work at Inside Climate News, which puts a premium on accountability journalism. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Ann Marshall-Chalmers, who contributed reporting, and Peter Aldis, an investigative data journalist who figured out how to make sense of the incredibly messy data kept by California's oil and gas regulators. I'd also like to thank my editor, Vernon Loeb, for giving me the time needed to do these stories and for pulling me out of the weeds that you inevitably get lost in when you go through this much material. I couldn't have done these stories without the help of experts who graciously answered all of my questions, but I'm perhaps most grateful to the people who trust me with their stories. They're so vital to helping citizens see how government's failures can have serious consequences on people's health and the environment. So again, thank you so much for this recognition.